Welcome. This is Friday, so it means that me and John Authers, Lisa Abramowicz, John Authers, get together and talk about the biggest story in markets of the week. This week, it was a little harder to tell.
Yes.
What the main story was, a lot of fascinating crosswinds kind of coming together. My biggest story, if you want to know the truth, comes today. And it comes for the sort of push-pull of Fed officials pulling ahead with this idea that they might be okay with raising rates sooner than they previously said, at the very same time that you see rates coming down and sort of concerns about a pandemic still ongoing as we see the shutdown in Austria and the potential for severe restrictions in Germany.
Yes, I think I certainly agree that that wave in Europe has, in the last 2 or 3 days, finally asserted itself in market attention. There were various houses that were doing regular COVID briefs with lots of statistics. They discontinued them a couple of months ago, and now it's back in the conversation. Obviously, awfully, painfully divisive issue for us all as members of society, whether it should be, but in terms of the economy, whether it's going to have an effect on markets, it's back, which does make for a very ironic disconnect with the fact that the Fed has, I think, rightly got to the point where they have to at least give themselves the flexibility, give themselves the room for maneuver to start hiking earlier than they had said.
And this is the reason why we've seen the dollar appreciate to such a degree,
Yes.
and why the euro has completely fallen out of bed. It's
Yes.
the lows, the weakest of the year, certainly relative to the dollar. I do wonder about policy divergence, and I do wonder about the knee-jerk reaction in U.S. markets to follow suit with the European trend, with yields coming lower today as we look at some of these lockdowns.
Yes.
How much can they diverge? I mean, at a certain point, that again becomes a question. If you have the Fed, do they have more free rein to perhaps wait a little longer if you have a Europe that still is, I don't know how to say flat in its back, but struggling?
Yes, is the straightforward answer to that. Partly because that means that there's less upward pressure from growth in general, and partly because if you're the Fed, you're the Fed. You're the US, and that still involves a certain amount of exorbitant privilege, as Giscard d'Estaing called it way back when, after Bretton Woods ended. My favorite factoid, which I'm very proud of from this week, was the Bank of Turkey, which is really not an independent central bank in any meaningful way now. President Erdogan has dismissed various governors at different points while he tries to get them to do what he wants. Cut interest rates by a percentage point yesterday. They have inflation of, from memory, something like 15% at the moment. And what is fascinating, and it's absolutely tanked their currency, and their central bank doesn't deserve to be regarded as a credible one at this point. They have a very serious problem. But amazingly, the Fed funds real rate compared to inflation is much, much lower than the Turkish base rate in real.
Oh, fascinating.
So at this point, Turkey's target rate, which I think is the 1 week repo rate, they call it there, but it's still just negative now in real terms. It's still only just below the level of inflation. And that's true whether you go with the core or with the headline. And here in the States, we have -4, -5% real Fed funds rate, depending on how you measure it. So it's the lowest it's ever been. It was never quite this far below inflation in the 70s. So there is a freedom of action, a freedom to try to get away with this in the US because it has the treasury market, because it has the dollar, that isn't extended to anyone else. Which I think it perhaps behoves us all to remember. This is a remarkably easy policy that we still have in this country.
That's a fascinating factoid, and there are a bunch of ways to go with this. The first one is the idea of Turkey, since you brought it up, did raise the issue. Yes, it is an idiosyncratic story. Yes, it is the central bank of Erdogan. Yes, they are doing something that is not in any economic book or frankly backed up by any economic theory, which is they have a high rate of inflation, so their easing policy, to try to reduce inflation. No one has ever said that that would work. It has not worked.
Apart from
there is a broader point.
It appears sincerely to believe that that will work. But sorry, carry on. Yeah.
No,
yes.
but you also saw the South African central bank also cut rates. And you also saw the rand lose value, weaken versus the dollar. Basically, they're trying to get ahead of capital flight as the U.S. prepares to tighten rates, attracting money into the United States, and are having trouble doing it. I do wonder if there is a more concerning message within this of an emerging markets disruption should the Federal Reserve hike rates. How do they then get ahead of it even further? If the Fed were to sort of move more quickly, how does the rest of the world cope, particularly in the developing world?
Well, this is my very great concern. We've mentioned before, I spent 4 years in Mexico where the issues of inflation and of cross currents with the states are obviously always a great issue. One of the things that bothers me, if you look at, it is good, actually very healthy in many ways, that the emerging markets is more of an idiosyncratic place than it used to be, that there is less money that moves into EM or out of EM than there used to be. It's become more of a discerning place. But the JP Morgan Emerging Markets FX Index is now at an 18-month low. So it's back to where it was when we were still only just off the floor from the COVID shutdown. And I think you probably would see it hit an all-time low if the Fed surprises in a hawkish direction from here. That, a number of the major emerging markets have definitely made themselves less prone to a strong dollar than they were. They don't borrow as much in dollars as they used to, but some of them, not just Turkey, still borrow a lot in dollars. And this is going to be. It was one of the dogs that didn't bark last year, but very nearly did, was a broader emerging market contagion following on from the excitement here. It's faintly possible that that's finally going to happen if it really is necessary to tighten at the worst range of expectations here because of the issue of capital flight.
I do wonder about that, especially as you get the likes of former New York Fed President Bill Dudley coming out and telling us that he could see the terminal policy rate of this cycle somewhere around 3 to 4%. Other people saying that's not unreasonable based on exactly what you were talking about earlier, that if you look at the actual policy rate and how the real rate is, it's actually lower, more negative in the United States than in Turkey. There's another issue too, though. Comparing Turkey and the United States, most people would say, just stop, give me a break. Terry Weissman of Macquarie this week said, actually, the analogy is apt in certain ways, that there is a fear that if there is a perceived politicization of the Federal Reserve and the chairman of the U.S. Central Bank, that could lead to a depreciation in the dollar. That could actually weaken some of the demand because it would make the central bank lose credibility.
I completely agree with that. It's one of the great. You need to look at America in the 70s to see the truth in that. The Burns and Miller chairmanships saw a steady loss of confidence in the Fed. I think what is fascinating here, don't get into political punditry, but I don't think I'm the only person who really wishes Joe Biden would get on with it and say what he wants to do in terms of nominating.
That's not political. That's just fact.
It just adds. It adds an unnecessary element of uncertainty to a critically important decision. But the amount that it is now being discussed does create a problem, particularly if, as I think he's perfectly entitled to do, he decides to choose Lael Brainard, which is that she is probably going to be tested by the market. I've talked to people who think that the Fed probably hikes earlier under Brainard than under Powell, because she is going to come under more attack from the market to prove that she's prepared to be hawkish, that there'll be this perception that she's been put in there to be a dove. I don't think at the moment Biden wants her to be too dovish, because at the moment inflation is at least as politically salient for him as unemployment. But the eddies of the way politics crosses currents with central bank monetary policy are indeed very dangerous, and you can imagine a situation where the Fed is perceived to have lost independence. I mean, I guess in the other example, I mean, the kind of attacks that Christine Lagarde is getting in Europe now, a German magazine calling her Madame Inflation and talking, but it's a serious it's mass publication newspaper with little rings to show exactly how expensive her scarf is and her handbag is and so on. I mean, that's the kind of nasty stuff that elected politicians have to put up with, but independent technical officers at banks generally don't, and it tells you something about the loss of independence or the politicization of the role.
The flip side of that, of course, is that this role is always politicized in the United States to some degree. The different presidents often will nominate somebody else, and we saw that certainly with Fed Chair Powell himself filling in for Chair Yellen, even though there wasn't any major criticism as to how she was operating. So there is that flip side to it. Going forward, there is an issue that I think is a potential tail risk that I do not see in the market outlooks heading into 2022. And before we wrap up, I'd love to get your take on what we're seeing in Europe, the idea of additional COVID waves and how that affects some of the calls that we keep hearing, a rotation into cyclicals, this whole idea of longer term rates gradually rising, of a Federal Reserve starting to think about tightening. I mean, these seem to be, there's a lot of dispersion as to what the outlook is, but these are some of the consensus calls, very few of them factoring in any additional restrictions around a pandemic.
Yes, I agree with that. I think we might have got to the point where we are too relaxed about the pandemic. It was fascinating. On Twitter, yes, okay, Twitter, we know how people behave. I just tweeted some charts showing what was happening to cases in Austria, and they're legitimately very, very scary. But and the amount of response I got. So what, John? What are you proposing? Come on, being told that I was providing pandemic porn, which is a word these days. Like people at this point will get triggered by your just even mentioning the subject of COVID.
That's telling. Because it's politicized. It's incredibly politicized. And we talk about COVID every day on air. Every day we get hate mail. Every day we get people saying, why are you trying to control our minds? And, on one hand, I understand there's an inclination of people having freedom. And on the other hand, freedom has different meanings, but depending on what society you live in, and having, freedom to move around. And is it also freedom not to get sick? I mean, these are such hairy issues. But then how do you address this sort of bridge the gap between the will get vaccinated and won't get vaccinated as we head into the winter months where people start to actually congregate inside?
I am, again, will get some people thinking that I'm living in this blue state bubble in Manhattan, blah, blah, blah. I am very, very alarmed by that prospect. The thing that, at a practical level rather than at an economic level, that most concerns me in what's happening in Europe so far is if you look at Germany, the number and the proportion of people getting into hospital who are vaccinated is increasing very noticeably week by week. You can see, speaking as somebody who's got 2 shots in him, but not a booster yet, you can see that it wanes. It really, not an epidemiologist, but that really does look like it wanes over time. One other quick point, if we want to get something to scare people. France has a presidential election next year. There are 2 very right-wing populist candidates up for election, one of whom is to the right of Marine Le Pen. I think if you do have another angry winter of dissension over COVID, that wouldn't be good for Macron, and the idea of a Trump-style populist getting into one of the 2 most powerful countries in the EU would be an interesting one for markets. We may yet learn to be looking a lot at French politics in the next few.
Real quick, what would that mean for markets?
I think they would. it would be very similar to the shocks that came with Brexit and Trump. They would be very scared, at least initially, whether they would actually be a significant change thereafter. There wasn't with Trump in terms of market outcomes, but there was in Brexit. I don't know, but it would definitely lead to higher volatility ahead.
All right, John Authers, Lisa Abramowicz, that does it for us today. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful weekend.